Hi, everyone. I'm Jessie Moore. I'm the moderator for this session. So if you do encounter any technical challenges, just drop me a note and I'll try to help and connect you with tech support. We are delighted to have you here at ISSOTL 2021, and we're joining a workshop titled Reimagining Pedagogies of Care within Professional and Preparation Programs. The session is an hour long. You can see that there is a question section where you can leave questions as we go along. But if you have any tech support needs, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to turn it over to Adria and let her take it away. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm Adria Hoffman. I am an endowed professor of practice at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I primarily teach future teachers. And my co-presenter is Miriam Sharifian. She is an assistant professor also in teacher education at James Madison University. And Miriam had some COVID-related travel hiccups at the last minute, so we were able to video record pieces that she was going to speak to. So I'll facilitate. You'll still get to hear from her, though it's a little video recording as we go. So I want to give you a little bit of information about what we're going to do today, but I also want to note that I've already realized that when I hit the present, I can't actually toggle back and forth as easily. So I'm going to ask our moderator, Jessie, to go ahead and just unmute and cut me off at any point if there are questions or things in the chat that to respond to, because this should really be a conversation. I know at this time of day, it may be hard to get a large audience, so we'll see how many folks are actually here and responding to some of the interactive pieces. But we'll just go from there and see what happens. Hopefully you can now see the slides. These are the learning goals that we included in our proposal, that by the end of this workshop, we'll be able to identify specific examples of learning activities that increase knowledge and address biases, perceptions, stereotypes, and attitudes. That we're going to know how to plan and implement critical pedagogical strategies that disrupt common situations or understandings, examine multiple viewpoints, and take action and promote social justice in practice. And we've prepared a toolkit of sorts, and it's not a massive document. It's a few pages with links to some of the tools and readings and other resources out there that we've found particularly useful in our work. Also some things that we created ourselves, and our information for contacting us. So a little bit about us. I'll let Miriam, hopefully the video will play and you'll be able to hear her, but I'll let Miriam introduce herself via recording.
Hello everyone, my name is Miriam Sharifian. I'm assistant professor of early childhood education at James Madison University, and I'm also a director of early childhood initiatives at JMU. I apologize that I'm not able to participate in this meeting and be present with you, but this is the way that I'm hoping that I can share my contributions with you. I am from Iran, and I finally have the opportunity to get out of the country and go see my sister in Vancouver. My flight, as probably many of you know, pandemic is not making the international trips easy, and honestly, it's very difficult. But my flight, unfortunately, it has a conflict with our presentation. Dr. Hoffman is my wonderful colleague, and she's my mentor in some level, and I really appreciate this work that we do together. I teach at James Madison University, and it's in Virginia. It's a pretty, my university is located in predominantly white population, and majority of my students are female. It's a small college town environment, and the university is growing. Our program is very strong teacher education program, and we have fascinating students in the classroom. We are hoping that we increase the diversity in our school. At the same time, that's just a diversity of ethnicity and race just being different. It's just, just having different languages in the classroom, but also making sure that the students with different experiences are well prepared in this program and welcome. So I'm excited about this work that we do together with Dr. Hoffman, and I look forward to hear your feedback at the end of this presentation. So you'll see my couple other videos throughout this presentation. Enjoy the session.
So she shared a little bit about James Madison University, where she works. I am at Virginia Commonwealth University, which is another similarly sized large public university in Virginia, but we're located in Richmond, which is a large metropolitan area. We have a much more diverse student population than JMU. For example, I'm trying to remember the exact percentages, but I want to say approximately a third of our incoming students are first generation, meaning they're the first in their family that would earn a college degree. We have a very large percentage of students at the university who identify as an ethnicity or race other than white. Within our teacher education program, we're still majority white, like many teacher preparation programs, but we are more diverse than our neighboring universities, and diverse in many ways. So I have many students who will be the first to earn a college degree. I have many students who grew up in poverty or working class families, as well as middle class and upper middle class families. So the range of socioeconomic diversity. I would say the majority of the students in both of our programs are either, non-religious or Christian. And at VCU, there's always at least 1, 2, or 3 students in each of my classes that are Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or another religious faith. So it's an interesting mix. Majority female still, because we both teach in the early and elementary childhood programs. But that's a little bit about our contexts. Oh, I don't want to hit play again. There we go. So just a quick poll here. You can hold up your device to use the QR code, or you can toggle over and click slido.com and enter that code there, 042219. This is just a quick, in what school or professional area do you work? And if you're here just because you're interested and you're not necessarily in a professional preparation program like nursing or social work or medicine or education, that's completely fine too. Just put your discipline. But I'd love to know who's here. So we'll give us a second to respond. Hooray, I'm here with my education friends. All right, so we'll move on. This is something that I actually use. This is one of the many questions I use at the start of every class that I teach. So I'm going to ask us to actually use the chat or just unmute yourself and share the response to this. I actually joke with my students, it's like an icebreaker that's not terrible. And I ask them, for what failure are you most grateful to have experienced? All of my many lesson failures as a teacher. I mean, yes, Andrea, I empathize. Oh, the other folks are quiet. Okay, so let me just think aloud with you for a minute. I also ask questions at the beginning of each course, like, to what organization, if you had excess money, to what organization would you donate? Or with what organizations have you had time to volunteer? Other things that are more values-based. And then I ask them, what did you learn from asking these questions? And they said, I've been in classes with my classmates before because we're in a professional preparation program, but I never got to know them this well. I knew where they grew up, or I knew where they went to school, or I knew when they decided to become a teacher. But now I know them better in a 3-minute back and forth. And I usually break them up into small groups to do this, and then we debrief together. The one reason that I particularly like this question is because it sets up failure as something that we should be grateful for. And they tend to, especially in a course, they're like, how do I pass, right? How do I get a good grade versus how do I fail? That sort of binary, and failure is a very negative, very standards-based thing. So this puts them in a space of, no, failure is great. And here's how this course is going to unfold for us. The other thing that I tell them about is when we have these sort of conversations with each other that are much deeper than where'd you grow up and what's your favorite color, we begin to have entry points for how we work together as professionals. So it sets up the entire course as that community of practice that we really, really love. So setting the course up with these are fantastic. I highly recommend this question, and I highly recommend other ones. There's a whole list of great resources if you've never explored high quality connections by Jane Dutton and many others in organizational psychology. I highly recommend that as well. So I'm gonna hopefully be able to toggle back and forth here successfully. We'll see how this goes. All right. We came to this presentation and our whole kind of analysis of practice from what we felt was a tension between programmatic requirements and what we've come to know as humanizing and critical pedagogies at the course level. We often heard colleagues talking about things like the inflexibility of accreditation requirements, or the inflexibility of external sites where we would place our students for practicum or student teaching internships. And for some reason, that seemed to be a source of great tension for people. We're like, how can we tackle this problem of practice while also then preparing future teachers, future public servants to come from a place of empathy and compassion? So another little quick Slido. What is one word, and you can respond multiple times here, what is one word you might use to describe care in your culture or community or family? I'm giving us some wait time to think of additional responses. These are so interesting, and I'll share why. So various cultures express care different ways. Sometimes care is like a word of kindness, but sometimes care is an action instead of a word. So one of the other kind of analogies to this is when I see articles on love languages. It's how do we express care? Some people do it in one way, some people do it another. And really when we think of pedagogies of care, it really has to do with the diversity of experiences and perspectives in the course. So some of that tension that we were experiencing, we started to see as cultural incongruity, particularly among faculty in a teacher preparation program that are predominantly white, middle class, and Christian, and how that was different from the rest of teacher education faculty in our programs, and particularly among the students who didn't have quite the same cultural backgrounds. So thinking about what care might mean and look like means that we have to represent it in multiple and different ways. I'm going to skip this because we have a little bit, we have a small group. So I'm just going to keep forging on. We framed our work as critical pedagogical practice. We really thought about McLaren's work in ethics of compassion. And like I said, it was not only an understanding of, but an empowerment of diverse ways of knowing and being. So that goes back to this idea of when we say care or a pedagogy of care, we're really amplifying those diverse ways of knowing and being and making sure that the ways in which we describe care and also enact care are not incongruous with the cultures represented in our classrooms and our programs and our departments. I'm going to let Miriam share a little bit more.
We intentionally designed what Irish described as high yet humanly calibrated expectations for learning. I think this is really a highlight and the most important part of our work together as two professors in education field. You can't, basically the whole idea and we love this code is because you need to have a holistic approach when you're teaching to students. See the students where they're coming from, what is their background, what is their culture, what are their needs, what are the trauma they've experienced in their life, what are the basic needs, and are they really met or not, and what they go through. If having policies and having requirements are important for sure, and they are making students be reliable and committed to their words are important, but are they realistic if we don't look at the students as holistic and we don't have consideration of what they're going through, what are their needs, and are we really meeting them where they are? So this is really the most important part of having this holistic approach and making sure that our teaching is responsiveness to students' holistic needs, and the framework of that supports educators in the way that our work is designed and enact to humanizing and transformative pedagogy responsive to emergent needs. So that's why we are, everything that in this presentation that we have, in this study that we do, are bringing the attention to how can we really be present with our students, build that trust, and make sure that we understand them, make sure that they trust us back, and make sure that this is the lesson that they will take away when they go to their own classroom, when they are the caregiver for the child that comes to the class. And that teacher, future teacher that we are training is going to be a caregiver and a teacher who sees the holistic of a child.
So what Miriam just described, what Miriam just described is really one of the other key pieces, which is the implications of the way that we teach as we prepare professionals to be professional helpers, right? If somehow we are not communicating care, compassion, and empathy, they will then potentially reproduce that in their own practice. So this big question is, what opportunities exist in our programs to reimagine learning as a humanizing student experience? So on the left, we thought about the program policies, and I tend to think of policies as big P's and little p's, meaning there are policies that are legit policies, but we often talk about policies that are actually practices. They're not really codified. It's a group of faculty sitting around saying, oh, let's come up with better wording for our attendance policies, and then we'll put it on all of our syllabi. But that's not necessarily codified policy in many spaces. So the first thing that we started to ask were, what are the actual policies versus what are practices that we then all adopt at any given period of time? So we thought about admissions policies, attendance policies, gates, and many professional preparation programs have these gates, not just at the admission point, but sort of have you met a competency or passed a licensure exam to move forward to the next place, to move forward to the next placement, clinical placement, community setting. And then often for all of us in our licensure regulations, our certification regulations, our accreditors talk about professionalism and what that means. We also looked a little bit, we zoomed in a little bit and looked just at our course syllabi. How do we define and describe things like attendance and grades? How are deadlines and due dates discussed? And what is a standard, right? How do they meet a standard? What does normal look like? And who might be excluded from that normal? So here are some of the findings, and we've copied and pasted from some syllabi that we found. Older syllabi, more recent syllabi, we found a number of punitive policies and practices. And like, for instance, those on the left, assignments expected on or before a stated due date, and anything received after that time would receive 10% lower than the earned grade. Or, for instance, one absence would be allowed without penalty, but any other absence would result in 4% deduction. So these are very punitive policies and practices. They often accompanied a statement around professionalism. And so that was kind of interesting to us. There also seemed to be this disconnect between learning and assessment, like saying late assignments will not be accepted, period. And a special one, like students may not make up assignments. We also found similar statements around revising assignments. So really, are we assessing their mastery of a competency, or are we assessing their ability to comply with a certain deadline? And those distinctions were really important, and again, brought us back to this idea of subjectively defining professionalism and the bias inherent in the ways that professionalism is defined within some professional preparation programs. So I want to go further with this idea of bias and professionalism on the left. For instance, statements like there'll be no texting or checking text messages during class. You are expected to follow these policies to demonstrate professionalism. In some syllabi it said, barring extenuating circumstances or being a caregiver, but sometimes we found that those were not present. Those qualifiers were not present. We also found this, and I'm going to explain it a little bit. All written assignments are to be typed double-spaced in 12-point font using standard grammar with no spelling errors. So again, standard grammar or standard communication is actually codified in the Virginia Department of Education professional standards for teachers, and it's part of the evaluation. Standard academic, standard English. So a very clear bias around that as well. And then broadly, these idea around late assignments and punitive assignments, we could say that there were implications of distrust, but we actually found a specific example where it was just, it's not even implying distrust. It's very open to us here when we say that late assignments couldn't just be turned into a professor, but we found one instructor that had on the syllabus, they must be turned into the department office, and that students had to ask someone in the office to initial the assignment, to write the time the assignment was turned in, and that person to put the assignment in the professor's mailbox. So to us, that's very much not only compliance orientation, but also very much I don't trust you to just turn it in and tell me what time you turned it in. So these are all potentially dehumanizing student experiences, not to mention some incongruity between the idea of actually assessing student learning and mastery versus student compliance. And I'm curious, I just want to pause for a second and ask what responses you have to some of these examples, or pushback perhaps to some of these examples. Who has the first question or response?
It's an interesting mix of statements, and I used to coordinate a first-year writing program and would see a lot of similar things that prompted discussions about what is our goal with these, and it's just, I don't know, I don't have a really well-formulated response other than that I've seen similar things, and it's always unsettling to me when we have that tension between how we're actually treating our students as humans versus as learners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think unsettled is definitely a feeling we share. Should we move forward for the sake of time? Oh, thank you, Andrea, for the comment. Right. University policies and external accrediting bodies. Those are key pieces. We're going to get to some of those too. Thank you. So moving forward, let's think about the non-example here. Regular attendance is required. And I mentioned this before, this idea of a very compliance orientation. I will go ahead and tell you one of my big successes, like me personally. I don't know if it'll be seen as a big success by all the people above me. I know my chair appreciated it, but we'll see how this goes. Like if I were to write my my annual report right now, I would say that my huge success right now is that I got our entire program to agree. I managed to convince them through dialogue and through modeling, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how I did it. It took some time, but we moved from a regular attendance as required. It actually was more than that. It was punctual attendance with the punitive, and there's a point deduction after this many misses, all those things. And I got us to move to what I put on the right. I have longer statements on this, but basically what we've done is we've included in all of our syllabi now that regular engagement and learning activities and dialogue will be key as we develop a professional learning community. Again, reinforcing the fact that as pre-professionals, we are part of a professional learning community, and that our course is that professional learning community. And then what is expected of me in the course? Weekly engagement, attending and completing work is essential for full course benefits. And then a little bit of description around that. So this is what's expected of me, but I'm not using the term attendance. I'm using the term engagement. And then throughout the syllabus, now I haven't gotten everybody to get the throughout the syllabus part yet, but we're still in aspirational phases here. But we've at least moved as a program, we voted as a program that we were all going to remove the old attendance policy and replace it with the idea of regular engagement. And I'll even go further, because some people, there was pushback. It was like, well, we can't just have that without any consequences. So the consequences became that if they missed a second class meeting, they had to just communicate with the professor. That's like, if I've done nothing else in life, I feel like that's my big shift. So that's my personal success story. Really moving from this idea of compliance to engagement, which just sets the tone, the foundation for truly engaging in the course and having opportunities to learn. So I want to go further. This is, again, this idea of non-humanizing to humanizing. Thanks, Jesse, for the feedback. I'm very excited too. Why is programmatic change hard? So I bring us back to this quote by Peter Senge. People don't resist change, they resist being changed. So in the toolkit, I actually have kind of a table that we've put together saying what might be the underlying issue and what might be the outcome. So I'm going to talk through it a little bit. For instance, many of our colleagues in helping professions, we all see ourselves as helpers in some way, right? Many of us see ourselves as advocates for equity, especially in public education. We're advocates for equity, we're advocates for social justice. And so for someone to say to us, hey, this thing that you've had on your syllabus for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or more is actually reproducing inequity, can be both a source of, it can feel like an attack on our identity, and it can also be a source of cognitive dissonance. Wait a minute, for 20 years, I've been an advocate for equity in schools. I am the diversity champion. I lead our DEI SIG in the School of Education, whatever the case may be. What do you mean that I'm not actually producing what I say I'm producing? So it's both the cognitive disconnect as well as the attack on identity. And I'll go back to something Andrea said. This idea of autonomy within courses. I'm going to point out the wording that you used, because it's something that I think many of us have used. We refer to the courses we teach as my course. And what does that reflect? That reflects there's that our work is part of our identity, which of course it is. And also that autonomy we're given as course instructors often leads to this idea of, well, it's mine, I designed it, I did this, and now this kind of feedback feels problematic. You're telling me that I need to change. You're not necessarily saying there needs to be a change, right? So it's very personal for many of us. The other reason that it can feel very hard is a misunderstanding of exactly what you noted. These external accreditation requirements, university policies, they're worded in particular ways. So sometimes it's really, really helpful to actually ask students to contribute with what they're experiencing. So for instance, in a course that I teach, I raised the idea of extensions. And particularly over the last year and a half, where our students have faced the multitudes of challenges that we're all facing, right? It's changes in work schedules, it's changes in workspaces, it's the ability to have, to log in remotely from various places. It's dealing with COVID-related illness and death in our own families. It's been hard. So why haven't some of the students asked for extensions when they could ask for an extension? And I go back further along my own journey. When I've asked students in the classes, they've said, well, it says on the syllabus, no late assignments will be accepted. So I brought this up in a program discussion, and they said, well, of course we would accept it if there's an issue, right? So it's not about what we're doing, it's about how someone else is interpreting it. So if we can bring to the table a student's perspective, almost like doing cognitive interviews with students or focus groups, to say, here's what it looks like on the syllabus. Tell me what this means to you. Okay, and let me give you a scenario and how do you respond to that? And then to bring that back to the program group and say, this is how many of our students interpret this statement. That's going to lead to greater programmatic change versus saying this thing that is on some syllabi or your syllabi. That's harder to get to. So we need to move away from the identity and to de-escalate the feeling of threat among our colleagues for us to move further. So I want us to just take a moment. I always like plugging in this. I wonder, at this point, after what I've shared, who has the first question, wondering, noticing, or concern?
I'm curious if you have any lessons learned from those conversations with your colleagues about how to prompt this type of change. I can imagine that it sometimes is a bit difficult. It sounds like you, even in just what you've shared, there's some embedded strategies, but what might be the top takeaways that you would share with others looking to make similar change?
Yes, and thank you, Andrea, also for that, the same challenges. So, like I said, a lot of what Miriam and I have been able to accomplish has been incremental in our programs, and some of it remains aspirational. The first takeaway is to actually hear the students. So one of the, our next step in my own program actually is a ISSOTL project that I'm going to engage with two other colleagues who, I noticed would be good co-conspirators in this from the start. And we've started making changes in our own courses and then sharing that with each other. So the next step for us is to actually conduct some cognitive interviews with students, particularly those at the entry point to our programs, like in their first and second year. And we're going to pull some of these syllabus statements from across syllabi and actually conduct large-scale cognitive interviews to say, when you see this, what does this mean? And we're also going to push out kind of questionnaires. So a scenario like you have 3 major assignments due within a week, within 1 week. And you also started to notice that you're feeling a little tired, maybe even sick. How might you approach these upcoming deadlines and your health? And we're going to be able to collect those code those, and then share them back to the rest of the group. Because, for instance, the folks who see themselves as advocates for students or see themselves as caring, they describe themselves as caring and empathetic, may not realize the ways in which they structure their courses or provide feedback to students is being interpreted very differently by those students. So if we can get the student voices in response to these, then it's not about our perceptions. It's refocusing it on the student's experience. And that so far has been very impactful. We're hoping that more of this will help. Another piece of the puzzle is around wellness in general. There are very few people I see that haven't said that their own wellness in some way, shape, or form hasn't suffered over the last couple of years. So even just paying attention to stress levels has been big. So in the toolkit, you'll see something that Miriam's program has done around making sure students know where to get food or to contact them if they're struggling with where they're living, and then situating ourselves as the facilitators or connectors, but putting that in our syllabi. I've also now included the counseling center's 24-hour crisis line in my syllabus. And then just keeping track of some of these things to share back to other faculty, not to say who's disclosed particular things, by no means will we do that, but to say, you know, we're at the halfway point in the semester, and I've had 3 students who have said to me that they've struggled getting out of bed in the morning. So what does that tell us? Where can we find them additional resources? But are there other things that we might be able to do to take something off their plate, just like we're asking our administration to take something off of our plate? So that empathetic lens and relating it to our own experience seems to have been incredibly helpful in our work so far. I will share that when it comes to external requirements, often what happens is there's an external requirement, someone at a leadership level has to make sure that it's adhered to at scale. And so they send out messages that seem very linear in nature, or they'll send out an example, and program faculty will then take that to mean that's the only way to do something. So one of the things that I do in these program meetings when, and I'm not the program coordinator, by the way, I'm just somebody who, I'm a disruptor. And Miriam's really good at this too, and we've had conversations. We're both on our state board for our state chapter of teacher education associations, where someone will raise something, you know, oh, this requirement from CAPE, our national accreditation organization, or this requirement from SACS, or, you know, what's coming from the state higher ed board. And I'll say, all right, well, it sounds like we have questions that we need to ask before we can make a decision. One of the first questions I always ask is, who's doing it differently? Can we find out who's doing it differently and still meeting the requirement? And then we can compare some models. And that gets us to a place where we're no longer beholden to often misunderstandings of those external requirements, or we can find better ways to do them. And I can talk more about that. And Andrea, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Andrea or Andrea. I'm not sure, but please correct me. But I do want to circle back to this idea of accreditation requirements too.
Sure. Andrea is totally correct. And like you, I also work in a teacher education program that the students come into our program and we meet all of the university requirements that are required in order for our students. It is a post-baccalaureate degree, so it's a second bachelor's degree. But completing our program also gets them accreditation with the province of British Columbia as a teacher. And so their teaching certificate is then issued following their application, but the university sends everything for them. And I think that we have felt a lot of challenges. So I actually attend monthly meetings with our teacher education unit So we have an administrative unit, and then each of the departments within our faculty send representatives. And we have a lot of back and forth, right? This is where I noticed that you're having so many of the same challenges that we are, where they're saying, you know, according to accreditation, students have to have this many contact hours. So if they're missing, you know, more than one class or more than two classes in each of those areas, they're no longer meeting the accreditation standards. And that's fine. But at the same time, we have to deal with them with some empathy and understanding, because sometimes they have sick children at home.
Right.
Sometimes they have parents that they are caring for. Like, these are not people who are sitting around twiddling their thumbs when they're not in class with us. And I just find that it's really, really challenging, because yes, I think my course is very important. And again, I'm using because, you know, I'm one of the only.
We do.
Yeah, I'm one of the only people that teaches my course. So, you know, it is a course that I have designed, and I also refer to them as my students, because they're currently off on practicum right now, and I talk about them as my little ducklings. That I'm sending off into the world. And I work in a secondary, teach secondary, which is also a little bit different. But there is this challenge between, you know, how it is that this is all set up and the way that I've designed my course, which is competency based. So everything between September and December is developing competency. So the only thing that really is the pass-fail assignment is the final one, because everything leads into that. And that sort of is the way that I've been able to develop some agency in the course that I teach. And I think that you talked about a co-conspirator, and I think that that's very important. I have a colleague who I work with as well. But I also feel that it's really important for me to feel empowered, and then also to share that with my students and say, you know, you also have to deal with a provincial curriculum. I deal with an external accrediting body, but this is how I found agency in what I do based on what I think is important, because I'm also an educator. I was a high school teacher. Like, these are things that, as you talked about earlier, are very much built into how I understand what it means to be an educator. And agency is part of that, understanding that I'm given a curriculum, but I interpret that curriculum, I transform that curriculum, and it becomes something that is then received by my students later on.
Yes. And I think one of the things that you just hit on that I really appreciate is where we can help them understand agency. So I'll give you a specific example, because some of my colleagues, and going back to Jesse's question, how do you get your colleagues on board? This was one I specifically shared with some colleagues recently who were, they expressed great trepidation around allowing students to revise assignments. And part of that trepidation was really around, they're like, well, yeah, we do want them to be competency-based, but I can't just regrade the same thing over and over again. Or how do you right? So, so I've seen two things in my own, is that I revised how they're assessed, and that it's a single point checklist where there's a component that's complete, or it's incomplete or missing. You get the point for that component or you don't. And the bigger thing is that I'm providing you feedback to revise and resubmit. But when there's such a clear checklist, as opposed to like a multi-level developing proficient exemplary rubric, then it's clearer for them to include that. And then each of those assignments is one component of what becomes a final toolkit or handbook or whatever, right? And so they're revising along the way. And then the other thing that I share with them, and this provides the students greater agency as well, is the fact that we can coach them. So we can coach them to understand the difference between an external requirement and an internal one. So I'll say to them, you know, if you have something comes up, Miriam started using the hashtag life happens, and all they have to do is text her or message her on Canvas, life happens, and they get kind of like a free pass on the deadline. The way I do it in my classes, as I say, just email me or message me and say, I'm so sorry, I'm juggling too many things right now, but I will turn it in on this date. And then I know when to expect it, and it gives me a little bit of a breather, because if you get 70% of your class turning in something on time, then you could probably turn most of those around a little quicker, and then you've got a few more rolling in the next couple of days. But then we also have this question around agency at the end. So toward the end of each course, I say to them, okay, I just want to let you all know that grades are due on this date. So I definitely want to give you the chance to revise and resubmit if you need. And in order for me to do that with X number of students, I probably want to get you your submissions back like a week ahead of that, just in case there's extra revisions coming in that final week and I can still submit grades. So what date would you all recommend your final project actually be due? And it's usually slightly earlier than I would have picked, but that way they understand the distinction between, okay, I can just roll this assignment deadline in our class versus I have to submit your grades to the university by this date. And it gives them some choice and some agency to direct how we're doing the course. And that in and of itself then treats them like not only human beings, but pre-professionals who are going to have to make these same choices as they enter the field. Yeah. So
and I think, we also, one of the things I think about so much, sorry for cutting you off, is this also idea of why are we marking their first attempt at things?
Yes.
I've changed my assessment strategy so much because if they're doing a lesson plan for the first time, I don't know why I should be marking in quotation marks that because it's their first draft. So that's a place that we workshop, we partner, we do some lesson study together, we talk through everything. And so that by the time they've done that 3 or 4 times and they're a little bit more competent, then I'm happy to mark something and provide, teacherly feedback. But up until that point, it's also cut back for me a lot of the revise and resubmit, which is really nice. But at the same time, it's that, when you become a practitioner, and I think that this is the same with a lot of other professions, is when you become a practitioner, you have colleagues that you can lean on, that you can share, that you can talk things through. And we have to, for our students who are post-baccalaureate students, they have to learn how to do that because they're coming out of an undergrad where they are used to being sole by themselves. And so then we have to rebuild those collaborative skills that they may not necessarily have been working on since they were in high school themselves. So great, practice those things together. And then you can submit something to me for, again, in quotation marks. Right. But I don't think I should be assessing your drafts because you haven't learned how to do it yet.
That's exactly it. That's it, right? I think it goes back to this big question that we had of, what the distinction between assessment and learning, and are we assessing learning? And do we need to assess the learning at all times? Mm-hmm. Right? So the coaching and the feedback and the collaboration, that's one of the things that we know that novice teachers struggle with, right? They've been told to submit assignments on their own, and now they're part of a PLC or part of a grade level team, and they're like, how does this work? So to build that into what we do in our professional preparation programs actually leads to them being able to enter the field a little bit more smoothly. So it's all the above. I'm looking at the time, and I'm definitely about to skip a whole lot of stuff. But I uploaded all the slides before. I'm gonna cut Miriam off. These were 2 of her examples that she actually has them do to think about their different privilege and social identities and how that plays out. And so there was just a couple of great learning activities that we included in here, but I'm gonna go further because we are running a little bit behind time. I also wanted to share this. This comes from Pear Deck, which is definitely something known in the education world. These are some of their free things. I don't pay for Pear Deck. I use a lot of their free stuff. They partnered with the organization Facing History and Ourselves, which is based out of Boston, and does a lot of work around equity and education. So these are a few of their slides that they released this year that I actually built into the course, because these are slides, their whole slide deck on this was something that could be used in actual classrooms, but then we got to model it in class. And this, again, we use this, I want to say I used this the 2nd week during the semester, where they thought about times that they were seen, heard, and valued, and they discussed this in small groups. And then we use this poem talking about the distinctions between a safe space and a brave space. And then we thought about the space that they shared earlier, and they got to brainstorm and think about the ways in which it was imperfect, and the examples of people in that space working on side by side, which is, again, so meta because we're having that conversation as teacher educators, right? Our spaces are so incredibly imperfect, and we have these co-conspirators. So that then led us to co-constructing what our professional learning community might look like. And also then, like this semester, for example, I'm teaching an internship seminar. Some of you may know that as like a student teaching seminar, but these are the folks in their final semester of the program, and they are full-time in schools with a mentor teacher. And making sense of that once a week with their cohort and making sense of the imperfections they're seeing in practice is something that they need to actually spend time doing. So these, I highly recommend the Paradox slides and other things from Facing History and ourselves that have been, multiple levels of how we work. I was gonna do a whole thing on clinical experiences with a Jamboard, but I'm actually thinking maybe just having a conversation might be useful. But Ravitch described these key learning activities like racial literacy storytelling, communal restoring, counter storytelling, and peer inquiry groups. So, this social identities wheel, constructive learning, coaching that we've talked about as restoring, and I'll say a little bit more about that in particular. When we move away from punitive and disciplinary things, and we can intentionally build this coaching model, and this is harder for some of our colleagues to grasp, but it's not just about, for instance, the tension of, well, if I don't hold them to these things and then they're not punctual when they're out in their placements, we're setting them up for failure, but we're also potentially ruining our relationships with our community partners, both of which are true if you don't coach. But if you instead see a role not as like assessor and like compliance mandator, and instead see yourself as a coach, like let me help you navigate this professional world that you haven't experienced, then we're restoring the way that they see themselves. I'll give you another clear example going back to the extension. Another great one is you're struggling on a homework assignment. Have you asked your professor for help, or you just turn it in to get it in on time because it's due that night? And they think about it and they're like, oh yeah, we just turn it in. It needs to be done that night. I probably should have looked at it before it. I'm the one that's a terrible student. So then I go back and I introduce them to sociology of education research like Annette Lareau and Jessica Collarco, who found that help-seeking behaviors like asking a teacher for help falls along class lines. And Collarco's found that to fall as early as first grade. That middle-class parents coach their kids. They're like, oh, I see you're struggling with your homework. Do your best, but you know what? Let's put this aside tomorrow morning. Ask your teacher for help instead of turning it in. Versus students whose families are working class or living in poverty say, do your best. And then they begin to see the story that they've been told as a good or bad student is not necessarily the case, but something that is more systemic in our society. And then they begin to see themselves as change agents for students, being able to coach them versus mandating that that homework be turned in on a certain day. So they're both restoring it for themselves, and then they're also creating a new sense of agency and empowerment to make a change for the folks that they're going to serve. So those are the key things that I definitely wanted to hit before we turn it over. But I wanted to have a quick conversation also around this idea of clinical experiences or clinical practice. So most of us are teacher ed, so thinking about practicum placements, student teaching, or any other way that we have done that, don't bother with the QR code. We'll just have a quick conversation again. How might we promote their ability to enact social justice or to move the needle a little bit towards greater equitable opportunities to learn when they're out in the field and seeing these imperfections? How do we keep them from a place of, questioning their mentor teachers, cooperating teachers, principals, and instead asking questions or searching for an answer together. And I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So this is where I'm like all excited to start talking about this kind of stuff, because it is something that I teach social studies. So that's the first part of it. I teach elementary and secondary methods for social studies. So for me, a huge part of what they do is looking at issues of inequity and injustice and challenges, and especially the way that our curriculum is designed. So it's really exciting to have them go out and say, okay, great, look, watch your teachers that you're working with. We call them school advisors. So we have both school advisors and faculty advisors. So the school advisors are the cooperating teachers, and the faculty advisors generally represent the institution. And I said, go ahead, in your own head, you can keep track of all of the things that you find challenging. And we do a whole debrief when they come back from their short practicum about why do you think that person is making those decisions. And sometimes it's the hard fact that we have to be like, it's a tough job and it's a tough situation. And how are they making a best choice situation for all of the students in their classroom? And how are they engaging with things like universal design for learning principles, rather than necessarily helping the top students. And we have lots of conversations about what is the purpose of public education. And if the purpose of public education is in the public good, then we have to make sure that we are caring about those kinds of things, and that teachers are thinking. And I use a lot of Donald Schoen's reflection on action and inaction as part of that conversation. And I say, people make decisions in the moment that they may not necessarily reflect on afterwards and want to do, but having a conversation and asking respectfully and politely to the teacher as to why did you make that decision? What prompted that decision? Would you make the decision again if you were in a similar situation? And starting to unpack those quick decisions that people are making as they go, because sometimes it is good to criticize what's happening in the classroom if it's not the teacher that you want to be. And that's the other thing is, sometimes the cooperating teacher is not somebody whose philosophy jives with what we are doing, or, maybe committed to different or older ideas that our current teacher candidates are not necessarily engaging with.
Yeah. It's kind of that strange space too, because they're so nervous about messing everything up. Mm-hmm. And then they're also really knowledgeable, right? So it's, it's the communication skills again that become very problematic and challenging. And it's a tough thing. It's also tough. I've had a few of them that are like, oh gosh, it's the wrong decision, so I disagree and I can never work with someone like that. I was like, well,
absolutes are a hard place to live in.
Right? Yes. It's exactly. You are going to be disappointed by every job you will ever hold. Yes. Yeah, I think the funniest is some of the students that I've taught have said to me the biggest lesson they've learned is the mantra that I continuously say, which is humans are messy. Yeah.
Well, that's it. And they do all this beautiful planning, and they put all sorts, engage in teacher inquiry, and they're going also through teacher education again in this very wonderful way. And then they get into the schools and they're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. We keep talking about, so they're planning and they're thinking about, what a grade 8 student or a grade 9 student will do. And I'm like, okay, so what takes you 5 minutes takes them 45 minutes.
Right.
So break everything that is implicit in the things that you do, break those down into tiny little steps and take it out there. And they finally start to realize how challenging, messy, all of that sort of stuff, the whole process is. But unfortunately, it has to be often in concert with the practical experience, right? The theoretical that we give them in our teacher education program also does have to be combined. So anyways, Jessie, thank you. I know
we're at time, aren't we? So let me just quickly put this up. You're welcome to scan this QR code. I also, this will take you to just our short document with some of the things that we love and some of our own reflections on things and an invitation to engage with us further. And the slides. So you can download the slides directly from this session, and it has that QR code at the end as well. So yeah, thank you so much. And I guess we have to say goodbye.